Good enough in practice, but not good enough in theory. The French-Dutch No thus presents us with the latest chapter in the story of populism. For the enlightened, liberal, technocratic elite, populism is inherently proto-fascist, the demise of political reason, a revolt in the guise of an outburst of blind utopian passions. The easiest reply to this distrust would be to claim that populism is inherently neutral, a kind of transcendental formal political dispositif that can be incorporated into different political engagements. This option has been elaborated in detail by Ernesto Laclau. For Laclau, in a nice case of self-referentiality, the very logic of hegemonic articulation applies also to the conceptual opposition between populism and politics. Populism is the Lacanian objet A of politics, the particular figure which stands for the universal dimension of the political, which is why it is the royal road to understanding the political. Hegel provided a term for this overlapping of the universal with part of its own particular content: oppositional determination. Gegensätzliche Bestimmung, as the point at which the universal genus encounters itself among its particular species. Populism is not a specific political movement, but the political at its purest, the inflection of the social space that can affect any political content. Its elements are purely formal, transcendental, not ontic. Populism occurs when a series of particular democratic demands for better social security, health services, lower taxes, against war, and so on, is enchained in a series of equivalences, and this enchainment produces the people as the universal political subject. What characterizes populism is not the ontic content of these demands, but the mere formal fact that, through their enchainment, the people emerge as a political subject, and all different particular struggles and antagonisms appear as parts of a global antagonistic struggle between us, the people, and them. Again, the content of us and them is not prescribed in advance, but precisely the stake of the struggle for hegemony. Even ideological elements such as brutal racism and anti-Semitism can be enchained in a populist series of equivalences in the way them is constructed. It is clear now why Laclau prefers populism to class struggle. Populism provides a neutral, transcendental matrix of an open struggle whose content and stakes are themselves defined by the contingent struggle for hegemony, while class struggle presupposes a particular social group, the working class, as a privileged political agent. This privilege is not the outcome of hegemonic struggle, but grounded in the objective social position of this group. The ideologico-political struggle is thus ultimately reduced to an epiphenomenon of objective social processes, powers, and their conflicts. For Laclau, on the contrary, the fact that some particular struggle is elevated into the universal equivalent of all struggles is not a predetermined fact, but itself the result of the contingent political struggle for hegemony. In some constellations, this struggle can be the workers' struggle. In other constellations, the patriotic anti-colonialist struggle. In yet others, the anti-racist struggle for cultural tolerance. There is nothing in the inherent positive qualities of some particular struggle that predestines it for such a hegemonic role as the general equivalent of all struggles. The struggle for hegemony thus not only presupposes an irreducible gap between the universal form and the multiplicity of particular contents, but also the contingent process by means of which one among these contents is transubstantiated into the immediate embodiment of the universal dimension. Say, Laclau's own example, in the Poland of 1980, the particular demands of Solidarność were elevated into the embodiment of the people's global rejection of the communist regime, so that all different versions of the anti-communist opposition, from the conservative nationalist opposition through the liberal democratic version and cultural dissidents to leftist workers' protests, recognize themselves in the empty signifier solidarność. This is how Laclau tries to distinguish his position both from gradualism, which reduces the very dimension of the political. All that remains is the gradual realization of particular democratic demands within the differential social space, as well as from the opposite idea of a total revolution that would bring about a fully self-reconciled society. What both extremes miss is the struggle for hegemony, in which a particular demand is elevated to the dignity of the thing, that is, comes to stand for the universality of the people. The field of politics is thus caught in an irreducible tension between empty and floating signifiers. Some particular signifiers start to function as empty, directly embodying the universal dimension, incorporating into the chain of equivalences which they totalize, a large number of floating signifiers. Laclau mobilizes this gap between the ontological need for a populist protest vote, conditioned by the fact that the hegemonic power discourse cannot incorporate a series of popular demands, and the contingent ontic content to which this vote gets attached, to explain the supposed shift of many French voters who, till the 1970s, supported the Communist Party rather than the rightist populism of the Front National. The elegance of the solution is that it releases us from the tiresome topic of the alleged, deeper, totalitarian, of course, solidarity between the far right and the extreme left. Although Laclau's theory of populism stands out as one of today's great, and unfortunately for social theory, rare examples of true conceptual stringency, one should note a couple of problematic features. The first concerns his very definition of populism. The series of formal conditions he enumerates are not sufficient to justify calling a phenomenon populist. What needs to be added is the way the populist discourse displaces the antagonism and constructs the enemy. In populism, the enemy is externalized, reified, into a positive ontological entity, even if this entity is spectral, whose annihilation would restore balance and justice. Symmetrically, our own, the populist political agent's, identity is also perceived as pre-existing the enemy's onslaught. Let us take Laclau's own precise analysis of why one should count Chartism as populism. Its dominant leitmotif is to situate the evils of society not in something that is inherent in the economic system, but quite the opposite. In the abuse of power by parasitic and speculative groups which have control of political power, old corruption in Cobbett's words. It was for this reason that the feature most strongly picked out in the ruling class was its idleness and parasitism. In other words, for a populist, the cause of the trouble is ultimately never the system as such, but the intruder who corrupted it, financial manipulators, not capitalists as such, etc. Not a flaw inscribed into the structure as such, but an element that does not play its part within the structure properly. For a Marxist, on the contrary, as for a Freudian, the pathological, the deviant misbehavior of some elements, is the symptom of the normal, an indicator of what is wrong in the very structure that is threatened with pathological outbursts. For Marx, economic crises are the key to understanding the normal functioning of capitalism. For Freud, pathological phenomena such as hysterical outbursts provide the key to the constitution and hidden antagonisms that sustain the functioning of a normal subject. This is also why fascism definitely is a populism. Its figure of the Jew is the equivalential point of the series of heterogeneous, inconsistent even, threats experienced by individuals. The Jew is simultaneously too intellectual, dirty, sexually voracious, hard-working, financially exploitative. Here we encounter another key feature of populism not mentioned by Laclau. Not only is, as he is right to emphasize, the populist master signifier for the enemy empty, vague, imprecise, and so on. To say that the oligarchy is responsible for the frustration of social demands is not to state something which can possibly be read out of the social demands themselves. It is to provide from outside those social demands by a discourse on which they can be inscribed. It is here that the moment of emptiness necessarily arises, following the establishment of equivalential bonds, ergo vagueness and imprecision, but these do not result from any kind of marginal or primitive situation. They are inscribed in the very nature of the political. In populism proper, this abstract character is, furthermore, always supplemented by the pseudo-concreteness of the figure that is selected as the enemy, the singular agent behind all the threats to the people. One can today buy laptops with a keyboard that artificially imitates the resistance to the fingers of the old typewriter, as well as the typewriter sound of the key hitting the paper. What better example of the recent need for pseudo-concreteness? Today, when not only social relations but also technology are becoming more and more opaque, who can visualize what goes on inside a PC? There is a great thirst to recreate an artificial concreteness in order to enable individuals to relate to their complex environs as if it were a meaningful life world. In computer programming, this was the step accomplished by Apple, the pseudo-concreteness of icons on the desktop. Debord's old formula about the society of spectacle is thus receiving a new twist. Images are created in order to fill in the gap that separates the new artificial universe from our old life world surroundings. That is, to domesticate this new universe. And is the pseudo-concrete populist figure of the Jew that condenses the vast multitude of anonymous forces that determine us, not analogous to a computer keyboard that imitates the old typewriter keyboard. The Jew as the enemy definitely emerges from outside the realm of social demands that experience themselves as frustrated. This supplement to Lacau's definition of populism in no way implies any kind of regression to the ontic level. We remain at the formal ontological level, and while accepting Lacau's thesis that populism is a certain formal political logic, not bound to any content, simply supplement it with the characteristic, no less transcendental than its other features, of reifying antagonism into a positive entity. As such, populism, by definition, contains a minimum, an elementary form, of ideological mystification, which is why, although it is effectively a formal frame matrix of political logic that can be given different political twists, reactionary nationalists, progressive nationalists, nonetheless, insofar as it displaces in its very notion the immanent social antagonism into the antagonism between the unified people and its external enemy, it harbors, in the last instance, a long-term proto-fascist tendency. In short, I agree with Lacau's attempt to define populism in a formal conceptual way, also taking note of how, in his last book, he has clearly shifted his position from radical democracy to populism. He now reduces democracy to the moment of democratic demand within the system. However, as is clear to him, populism can also be very reactionary. So how are we to draw a line here? So, again, is there a way to draw the line at a formal conceptual level? My wager is that the answer is yes. Every construction of an action on behalf of the people as a political subject is not eo ipso populism. In the same way that Laclau likes to emphasize that society does not exist, nor does the people. And the problem with populism is that within its horizon, the people does exist. The people's existence is guaranteed by its constitutive exception, by the externalization of the enemy into a positive intruder, obstacle. The formula of a truly democratic reference to the people should thus be a paraphrase of Kant's definition of beauty as Zweckmäßigkeit obnijuik, the popular without the people, namely the popular cleft, thwarted, by a constitutive antagonism which prevents it from acquiring the full substantial identity of a people. That is why populism, far from standing for the political as such, always involves a minimal depoliticization, naturalization of the political. This accounts for the fundamental paradox of authoritarian fascism, which is that it almost symmetrically inverts what Chantal Mouffe calls the democratic paradox. If the wager of institutionalized democracy is to integrate the antagonistic struggle itself into the institutional differential space, transforming it into regulated agonism. Fascism proceeds in the opposite direction. While fascism, in its mode of activity, brings the antagonistic logic to its extreme, talking about the struggle to death between itself and its enemies, and always maintaining, if not realizing, a minimal extra-institutional threat of violence, of direct pressure of the people, bypassing the complex legal institutional channels. It posits as its political goal precisely the opposite, an extremely ordered hierarchical social body. No wonder that fascism always relies on organicist, corporatist metaphors. This contrast can be nicely rendered in terms of the Lacanian opposition between the subject of enunciation and the subject of the enunciated, content. While democracy admits antagonistic struggle as its goal, in Lacanese as its enunciated, its content, its procedure is regulated systemic. Fascism, on the contrary, tries to impose the goal of hierarchically structured harmony through the means of an unbridled antagonism. In a homologous way, the ambiguity of the middle class, this contradiction embodied, as Marx put it apropos Proudhon, is best exemplified by the way it relates to politics. On the one hand, the middle class is against politicization. It just wants to sustain its way of life, to be left to work and live its life in peace, which is why it tends to support the authoritarian coups, which promise to put an end to the crazy political mobilization of society, so that everyone can return to his or her work. On the other hand, members of the middle class, in the guise of the threatened patriotic, hard-working moral majority, are the main instigators of grassroots mass mobilization in the guise of rightist populism. For example, in France today, the only force that truly disturbs the post-political, technocratic humanitarian administration is Le Pen's Front National. Populism is ultimately always sustained by ordinary people's frustrated exasperation, by a cry of, "I don't know what's going on. I just know I've had enough of it. It can't go on. It must stop." An impatient outburst, a refusal to understand, exasperation at complexity, and the ensuing conviction that there must be somebody responsible for all the mess, which is why an agent who is behind the scenes and explains it all is required. Therein, in this refusal to know, resides the properly fetishistic dimension of populism. That is to say, although at a purely formal level, the fetish involves a gesture of transference onto the fetish object, it functions as an exact inversion of the standard formula of transference, with the subject supposed to know. What the fetish gives body to is precisely my disavowal of knowledge, my refusal to subjectively assume what I know. Therein resides the contrast between the fetish and the symptom. A symptom embodies a repressed knowledge, the truth about the subject that the subject is not ready to accept. This is why Freud engaged in speculating on how the fetish is the last object seen before stumbling upon the fact that women do not have penises. It is the last support of the subject's ignorance. Linked to this are some further weaknesses of Laclau's analysis. The smallest unit of his analysis of populism is the category of the social demand, in the double meaning of the term, a request and a claim. The strategic reason for choosing this term is clear. The subject of the demand is constituted through raising this demand. The people thus constitutes itself through an equivalential chain of demands. It is the performative result of raising these demands, not a pre-existing group. Laclau calls such an elementary demand, prior to its eventual enchainment into a series of equivalences, democratic. In his slightly idiosyncratic usage, such a term refers to a demand that functions within the socio-political system. In other words, it is encountered as a particular demand, rather than being frustrated and, thus, forced to inscribe itself into an antagonistic series of equivalences. although he emphasizes how, in a normal, institutionalized political space, there are, of course, multiple conflicts. But these conflicts are dealt with one by one, without setting in motion any transversal alliances, antagonisms. Laclau is well aware that chains of equivalences can also form themselves within an institutionalized democratic space. Recall how, in the UK, under John Major's conservative leadership in the 1980s, the figure of the unemployed single mother was elevated into the universal symbol of what was wrong with the old welfare state system. All social evils were somehow reduced to this figure. Why is there a state budget crisis? Because too much money is spent on supporting these mothers and their children. Juvenile delinquency, because single mothers do not exert enough authority to provide proper educational discipline, and so on and so forth. What Laclau neglected to emphasize is not only the uniqueness of democracy with regard to his basic conceptual opposition between the logic of differences, society is a global regulated system, and the logic of equivalences, the social space as split into two antagonistic camps, which equalize their inner differences, but also the full inner entwinement of these two logics. The first thing we should note here is how, only in a democratic political system, the antagonistic logic of equivalences is inscribed into the very political system as its basic structural feature. It seems that Mouffe's work is here more pertinent in its heroic attempt to bring together democracy and the spirit of agonistic struggle, rejecting both extremes. On the one side, the celebration of heroic struggle confrontation that suspends democracy in its rules, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Schmitt. On the other side, the evacuation of true struggle from the democratic space, so that all that remains is anemic, rule-regulated competition, Habermas. Here, Mouffe is right to point out that violence returns with a vengeance in the exclusion of those who do not fit the rules of unconstrained communication. However, the main threat to democracy in today's democratic countries resides in neither of these two extremes, but in the death of the political through the commodification of politics. What is at stake here is not primarily the way politicians are packaged and sold as merchandise at elections. A much deeper problem is that elections themselves are conceived along the lines of buying a commodity, power in this case. They involve a competition between different merchandise parties, and our votes are like money, which buys the government we want. What gets lost in such a view of politics as just another service we buy is politics as a shared public debate of issues and decisions that concern us all. Thus, democracy, it seems, not only can include antagonism, it is the only political form that solicits and presupposes it, that institutionalizes it. What other political systems perceive as a threat, the lack of a natural pretender to power, democracy elevates into a normal, positive condition of its functioning. The place of power is empty. There is no natural claimant for it. Polemos struggle is irreducible, and every government must be fought out, gained through polemos. This is why Laclau's critical remark about Lefort misses the point. Quote, "For Lefort, the place of power in democracies is empty. For me, the question poses itself differently. It is a question of producing emptiness out of the operation of hegemonic logic. For me, emptiness is a type of identity, not a structural location." End quote. The two emptinesses are simply not comparable. The emptiness of the people is the emptiness of the hegemonic signifier, which totalizes the chain of equivalences. That is, whose particular content is transubstantiated into an embodiment of the social whole, while the emptiness of the place of power is a distance which renders every empirical bearer of power deficient, contingent, and temporary. The conclusion to be drawn is that populism, in the manner we have supplemented Laclau's definition of it, is not the only mode of existence of the excess of antagonism over the institutional democratic framework of regulated agonistic struggle. not only the now defunct communist revolutionary organizations, but also the wide-scale phenomena of non-institutionalized social and political protest, from the student movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s to later anti-war protests, and the more recent anti-globalization movement, cannot be properly called populist. Exemplary is here the case of the anti-segregation movement in the US in the late 1950s and early 1960s, epitomized by the name of Martin Luther King. Although it endeavored to articulate a demand that was not properly met within the existing democratic institutions, it cannot be called populist in any meaningful sense of the term. The way it led the struggle and constituted its opponent was simply not populist. A more general remark should be made here about the single-issue popular movements, for example, the tax revolts in the US. Although they function in a populist manner, mobilizing the people around a demand which is not met by the democratic institutions, they do not seem to rely on a complex chain of equivalences, but remain focused on one singular demand.